In this first lecture, as an introduction to philosophy, I'm going to cover some history of philosophy, some conceptions of what philosophy is and what it has been, but I'll also try to give you an idea of what you'll actually be doing in a philosophy course. Philosophy, the Greek terms philia, kind of love, and sophia, wisdom, come together to form the concept love of wisdom. Philosophy is a human practice that to some degree all people from all over the world have engaged in, or at least have the potential to engage in. Philosophy has been done differently throughout history and around the world, but there is some fundamental subject matter, I guess you could say, that connect these different ways of loving wisdom. From east to west, any inquiry concerned with the nature of morality, knowledge, reality, and truth is basically a precursor to philosophy. In the East, ancient doctrines have developed that answer questions of morality, such as Confucianism, and doctrines that analyze the natures of reality and knowledge, such as Taoism and Buddhism. But in the Western world, philosophy as we know it developed primarily in ancient Greece. The earliest known origins go back to what we call the pre-Socratics. Socrates was so important to the development of philosophy that he had eras named after him, and everyone before Socrates was just pre-Socratic. Some notable pre-Socratic philosophers included Thales, who is often considered the father of Western philosophy, Heraclitus, who is recorded as saying you cannot step into the same river twice, claiming that the world is in constant flux. And then Parmenides, credited with the idea that what is, and what is not, is not. He argued for the existence of a single, unchanging reality and challenged the concepts of change and even death. Pythagoras, who we all remember from math class, he's famous for the idea that all is number. He and his followers believed that mathematics and numbers were the foundation of reality. There were other famous pre-Socratics, but these are the ones that came to mind while writing this introduction. The pre-Socratics seemed to be primarily interested in natural philosophy, what philosophers would eventually develop into the natural sciences. The pre-Socratics theorized about the nature of the world and its ultimate or underlying substance. Different theories emerged, such as appeals to essential elements like earth, air, fire, and water. Well, the Pythagoreans, as we discussed earlier, believed that the universe was fundamentally composed of numbers, but it's not clear exactly what they meant by that. There were other theories, but for a basic intro, we don't really need to survey all of them. The pre-Socratics were so called because once Socrates hit the scene, everything changed. Socrates was thought to be the son of a sculptor, or stonemason, named Sophroniscus, and a woman, Phaenarete, described by Plato as a burly midwife. Socrates may have been raised as a stonecutter assisting his father, but we do know he served in the army on multiple occasions. Socrates claimed to have learned rhetoric from Aspasia of Miletus, and the nature of love from a priestess, Diotima of Mantina. By giving credit to these women as his primary educators growing up, Socrates seems to have a more favorable attitude towards women than other men of the time. Socrates is thought to have philosophized similarly to his predecessors in early life. For example, in the Phaedo, he talks about his early desire to know that department of philosophy, which is called the investigation of nature. However, Socrates' investigations into such things were less fruitful than he wanted, and after the Delphic oracles decree that no one is wiser than Socrates, he turned his attention toward what he thought was more important, or rather, what he thought was most important, and that is human excellence or virtue. Socrates' method of philosophy was also revolutionary. Instead of writing treatises full of claims about physics and metaphysics, Socrates used dialectic to infer logical conclusions. Socrates still discussed math and science at times, but virtue was his primary concern. This was the beginning of the so-called Socratic turn, or Socratic revolution, after which the Socratic era began. Plato and Aristotle were the key inheritors of Socratic philosophy, which would in turn shape the way Western philosophy would be done from then on. Plato immortalized his teacher after he was executed by using Socrates as the central character in most of his published work, and even though virtue was still a primary focus of his philosophy, Plato also made time for math, science, and metaphysics. Plato's student, Aristotle, also retained virtue in his philosophy, but also developed sciences and systems like logic, biology, psychology, politics, and the list goes on with Aristotle. The influence of Socrates and the works of Plato and Aristotle would dominate Western thought for millennia. With the dialectical approach of Socrates and the development of logic achieved by Aristotle, the stage was set for humanity to start engaging in analytical philosophy. So what are we doing when we philosophize in this way? There are many ways to say this, but one way is to say analyzing and answering questions about every discipline, including philosophy. Philosophy is not like other subjects as a subject, but rather a critical approach to all subjects. Every subject is within the scope of philosophy. Our primary motivation is wonder, and our primary tool is logic. Philosophy, therefore, is not interested in opinions, but the truth that may underlie some opinion. Today, in philosophy, regardless of the topic or inquiry, strict adherence to logic is the most basic requirement for engagement. Logic has become the tool for philosophy and science that Aristotle intended it to be. The hand-waviness of the ancient works, though rigorous nonetheless, no longer flies. Conclusions must follow rigorously from their premises, thoroughly, consistently, and systematically. Philosophy isn't just saying what you think, or whatever you think initially, or feel, or whatever you want to say. Whatever conclusion you endorse, whatever science you attempt to use or create, whatever change you wish to advocate for, must be logically, mathematically, or otherwise scientifically sound or cogent. I'll explain these criteria further in future lectures. This question, what is philosophy, is answered in many ways, but that doesn't mean that different answers are incorrect or incompatible. Before we look at some academic accounts, let's illuminate the less precise common accounts. First, forget all of the common uses of philosophy, like blah blah blah, that's my philosophy, or philosophy is all about opinions, or philosophy is all subjective. These are all uninformed, unprecise uses of the term. A very simple definition that Maricosta College professor Garrett Miller sometimes gives is thinking really hard about stuff. Notice that, though simple, it is not opposed to the descriptions I've given earlier. Another description of philosophy given by Professor John Sanders at the Rochester Institute of Technology defines philosophy as the study of questions that don't precisely lend themselves to clear-cut solutions. Professor Sanders gives examples from the development of natural sciences out of natural philosophy. He notes that if you go back in time, general and special sciences were all parts of philosophy until enough domain-specific progress had been made to separate them as standalone sciences. In essence, with philosophical advancements such as Newton's work, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, and the developments of modern scientific methods, philosophers were able to make some of these natural questions clear-cut enough to treat them on their own in sciences such as physics, while reserving their more fundamental difficulties and presuppositions for philosophy of science, such as the problem of induction, the presupposition that the universe is discoverable to our senses, and so on. Another example that follows this same development would be the development of psychology from the philosophy of mind. Notice that Sanders, Miller's, and my own descriptions of philosophy are compatible. As Sanders said, it involves creating new sciences as philosophers make progress in clarifying problems. As Miller said, it involves thinking really hard about these problems. And as I said, the remaining clear-cut presuppositions, or the remaining unclear-cut presuppositions, will remain in the realm of philosophy until they're clarified to such a degree that they can be handed over to the special sciences. But even as general and special sciences develop, there will always be philosophy of these sciences. As Sanders and Professor Jeffrey Kaplan of the University of North Carolina at Greensboro point out, we philosophize about everything. There are established philosophical disciplines for every discipline, such as the philosophy of science, of physics, of psychology, mathematics, religion, and the list just goes on. Further, as Sanders notes, the highest awardable degree in academic fields outside of medicine and law is the PhD, which means Doctor of Philosophy in your specific discipline. It means you're able or capable of engaging in your discipline at the philosophical level. As a final set of examples, also from Kaplan, consider empirical and mathematical questions. Empirical questions such as, do chickens give birth to live offspring or lay eggs, is an empirical biological question. Just observe the process and you have your biological answer. Questions of mathematics, such as, is 9 divisible by 3, or do the interior angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees, are not answered by observation, since numbers and geometric shapes, in the strict sense, are abstract entities that we have never really seen in real life. We see and use representations of numbers and geometrical shapes all the time, but numbers themselves and two-dimensional shapes do not actually exist in physical reality. So strictly speaking, they can't be observed. Questions that cannot be answered empirically or mathematically are often the questions of philosophy on Kaplan's view. Though it's a bit different and a bit more specific than the views I introduced earlier, notice that Kaplan's view is compatible. It involves thinking really hard, forming logical arguments, and philosophical problems are those that are not clear-cut, and definitely not as clear-cut as empirical or mathematical questions. What is philosophy is a question that you will be refining an answer to for the rest of your life if you continue to study philosophy. After all, it's a philosophical question. But from these conceptions, we can derive some basic rules for doing philosophy. When doing philosophy as an undergraduate, think of it as an activity or game with some specific rules. Rule number 1, everything you endorse must be logically defensible. Saying, "this is just my opinion," is not a legal move in this game. Treating opinions, feelings, or unsupported beliefs as though they are arguments on their own are all fouls. Rule number 2, don't take it personally. Since philosophy is concerned with truth, not opinion, you must have a logical argument for your position. That means, if you find that the position you want to defend is logically indefensible, you need to change your position so you can keep playing the game. You don't need to change your belief in real life. You just need to argue for something that follows logically so you can win the game. And you must follow the rules to win the game. And the goal of this game is to get an A in the class. Rule number 3, think everything through more than once. Philosophy requires rigorous habits of thought, and our initial reactions to views that challenge our own are often bias-laden. If you only think through an argument once, you just give your initial reaction. You haven't philosophized about it. You must read through it carefully and analyze how the conclusion is supposed to follow from your premises. Then, you need to make it explicitly clear why you agree or disagree. From there, if you disagree, make your counter-argument explicit and make sure you're not committing any fallacies in your argument. Then, compare your argument to the original argument to make sure 1. Your argument is actually a counter-argument, and 2. Be able to clearly explain how your argument overcomes the original argument. Rule number 4. Be modest in your responses. Intellectual modesty is a prerequisite for wisdom. If you think you know everything already, then you cannot learn. People will not want to bother talking with you or sharing knowledge with you because it's a waste of their time and benefits no one. Immodesty in your responses can also lead to fallacious reasoning. If your response includes something along the lines of, "This person's argument is stupid," or "This person is crazy for believing blank," you could render your argument fallacious if you're not careful. Indeed, you might accidentally commit an ad hominem fallacy. Rule number 5. Attack the strongest version of the argument. To steelman an argument is the opposite of the straw man fallacy. Overcoming weak versions of arguments is a waste of time, because the first objection you'll have to deal with is just a stronger version of the view you defeated. Give arguments charitable readings and overcome the best version of your opposition. Rule number 6. Cultivate objections to your philosophical beliefs. Knowing and understanding opposing views will strengthen your own views. Formulate responses to these opposing views. If you find that other views are stronger than your own, maybe consider changing them. Rule number 7. Read actively and analytically. Don't skim, don't speed read, or read passively. Think about it as you read it. Once you've read it, try to explain it. Read secondary sources and compare them to your explanations, always analyzing the logic of what you're reading. And that brings us to rule number 8. Consult relevant disciplines. When formulating your position, or a response to someone else's, ask yourself, is there a relevant science that could shed some light on this issue? Perhaps you're forming an argument, a metaphysical argument, about the nature of time. If your belief is that time is an illusion, see what physics has to say. You'll find that your metaphysics is inconsistent with physics. So, it'll be on you to either disprove Einstein and update physics, or update your metaphysical belief to be consistent with the findings of modern science. In philosophy, your beliefs must be consistent with facts. So, that's my initial advice, and I really hope I didn't just talk anyone out of studying philosophy.